All right, I am coming to you today with another in my series of forgotten band instruments. And by popular request, I'm finally doing a woodwind, which means it's an instrument that I can actually play. Remember, I'm not a brass player. I suck at brass, but I'm pretty good at saxophone. And today we are talking about the bass saxophone. Now, I did a video comparing bass and bari sax a couple months ago. But today I'd like to talk about the role of the bass sax in the band and why it is a forgotten band instrument. Now, if you don't know, the bass sax is the original size of saxophone, the OG. It was the first size that Adolph Sax made back in the 1840s, late 1830s. I can't remember the exact date on there. He made a bass saxophone in the key of C. Now, the modern bass saxophone is always in the key of B flat. We only know of about two original bass saxophones in the key of C. The first one Adolph made, and then another one that was made some years later by another firm. This was the largest size of saxophone typically seen. There were a few contrabass saxophones made 100 to 120 years ago, somewhere in that ballpark. They were very uncommon and they were very difficult to play. The bass sax, though, was fairly common. You saw it in a lot of military bands. Yes, they would march these things. Now, the modern bass saxophone, like this Selmer style bass sax, is considerably heavier than the old vintage basses. But it is still a beast to march with, which is why I am thankful that this instrument has a floor peg. God. This was, for many groups, the lowest woodwind instrument that they would have available. It's from a time from before when contrabass clarinets were readily accessible. Selmer didn't introduce their E-flat contra, the great bass as we call it, or as I call it, trying to get that to catch on, until the early 1930s. LeBlanc didn't introduce their B-flat contrabass clarinet until the later 1930s, but didn't really start production until the 1950s. There were other instruments before then, but they were very rare. They were not generally production line instruments, so it was difficult to get a hold of them. Contrabassoons were really only seen in orchestras. Orchestras would have the money to be able to get a contrabassoon. Wind bands typically didn't. Some of the very largest wind bands would. Names like Patrick Gilmore, John Philip Sousa would occasionally have a contrabassoon, but they would also have a sarrusophone, which you've undoubtedly seen me using in a few videos lately, as sarrusophone videos have gone viral. But the bass saxophone was made by the hundreds, if not the thousands, here in the United States, as well as makers in France and a few in Germany as well. But this was the largest and lowest commonly seen woodwind, and thus many band scores would have a part for this instrument. We see it in many places. The most notable is, of course, the works of Percy Grainger, all of which have a bass saxophone part. Grainger's typical saxophone section was soprano, alto, tenor, baritone, and bass. He preferred a five-section group. A five-member section. But, of course, we don't see the bass sax too often today. There's a few reasons for that. The biggest one is the Great Depression. You see, in the 1920s, we had what's called the saxophone craze. People went nuts for the saxophone. It was produced in the thousands by companies like C.G. Kahn, Fisher, Martin, King, Holton, and among others. They were producing hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of saxophones in the 1920s of all different sizes, from the bass all the way to the tiny sopranino. there were saxophone bands. You were seeing them in wind bands. You were seeing them in jazz bands. There was a push to get them in orchestras here in the United States with composers like George Gershwin, John Alden Carpenter. They were all using saxophones like crazy in the 1920s. And then 1929 happened, and the stock market crashed, and the saxophone craze died almost instantaneously. Following that, we have World War II. So we have the 30s. Nobody has money. There's not any extra money to go around. Luxury items like a saxophone are harder to come by. Further that, the most luxurious of the saxophones, the bass, is the least in demand. Why? You can use a baritone to do most bass lines. You can use a tenor for jazz, an alto for wonderful singing melodies, a soprano on the top voice. These are all considerably less expensive than the bass. So people weren't buying them as much. Production declined. By the 1950s, production on bass saxophones had almost completely stopped. I'm not sure the exact timeline of when Bisher and Kahn stopped production, but it's probably in the 1940s. By the 50s, they aren't making these anymore. You might see one from a French company. Noblet had a model they would use. Selmer wouldn't come out with their updated model probably until the 1980s. They had the Mark VI that came out in the 60s. But there's a time when you're just not seeing them get produced. And when they are being produced, they're expensive. They're exorbitantly expensive. So when you see this part in a wind band piece, and you see this instrument that's really expensive, it's like, I don't need it. I don't want to give this expensive instrument to my student who's going to, one, maybe not be heard, two, maybe damage the instrument. It's not worth my return on investment. And so, slowly, this instrument starts disappearing from wind bands. You do see composers using it in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. Alfred Reed is a great example. A piece like Armenian Dances has an important bass saxophone part, as does Karel Husa's Music for Prague, 1968. But by the 70s and the 80s, you're not seeing this instrument anymore. It completely disappears from wind band scoring. There are a few exceptions. There is an optional part for bass saxophone in David Maslenka's Symphony No. 2. However, I don't know if it's actually ever been performed on bass sax. It's always covered on the contrabass clarinet. Maslenka did, however, include it in his much later Symphony No. 8 with an important, almost virtuosic part that's surprisingly difficult. Another composer who did use this was Christopher Rouse in his Wolf Rounds, where he only scored for a baritone and a bass. That's the only instruments in the sax section. Those two. Cool piece. It's very rarely performed, probably because you gotta bring the bass. Today, though, what we're seeing is a resurgence in bass saxophone playing. People are picking up the older Kahns and Bishers, and they're breathing new life into them. Those are becoming highly valued instruments now. And instruments like this, the Jinbao clone of the Selmer, are surprisingly affordable now. And that means your amateurs can have access to bass sax. So, for instance, in my wind band, we performed my wailing songs a month or so ago, and we did two performances. On the first performance, I brought my bass sax and played the little melody at in the middle of the Wellerman. Well, in the second performance, we had somebody else bring a bass sax. So we had two people in the group with access to bass saxophones. Unheard of 20 years ago. But there you go. The instrument is making a comeback. Now, I guess you probably want to hear some on it. Let me, let's see. What can I play? Do I have anything around me? Yes, I do. I have some music right behind me. Okay, I'm going to play a couple excerpts here from Lincolnshire Posy, one of my all-time favorite pieces. Last time I performed it, we didn't get to use the bass sax, unfortunately. Actually, I don't think I've ever gotten to perform it with the bass sax. Let's see. First thing, I've got rehearsal 51 from the Ruford Park Poachers. Gives you a little bit more of the lyric nature of it. And let's see, how about the opening of Horkstow Grange? The beautiful second movement. And so on and so forth. I get you a little bit of the lyric nature of the instrument. And how about something just a little bit more raucous? The Brisk Young Sailor. Now, this beast, of course, takes a lot of air. So if you see me gasping while I'm playing, there's a lot of air going into this. But it's remarkably easy to play for such a large instrument. And I, for one, absolutely welcome the return of the bass sax, an instrument that is no longer a forgotten band instrument. Let me know if you've ever played a bass sax or if you've ever written for a bass sax. And until next time, where we'll explore some more forgotten band instruments.